Laura Lester. I'm the director here at California UIC School of Art and Art History. Welcome. We are so pleased to have Erin Manning, a cultural theorist, political philosopher, and practicing artist, as our guest this evening. But before I talk a little bit about Erin by way of introduction, I want to highlight two upcoming events here at California as the semester closes. So this Wednesday, just in a couple days, Julia Klein, who is a Chicago-based artist and publisher, will be speaking about her work in the MFA student-organized series called Form Fit. So that's Wednesday night at 7 p.m. And then next week, also on Wednesday, however, from 5 to 8, is the reception for our upcoming exhibition at California called Our Duty to Fight. Our Duty to Fight is an exhibition organized by Black Lives Matter Chicago around state violence against Black folks here in Chicago and in the vicinity, as well as the local movement for Black Lives. Artists have created new works in consultation with the families of people killed here in Chicago by police and nearby. And we've also included in the exhibition campaigns to support Black life, whether those are those for a Southside Trauma Center, local open enrollment school, or reparations for torture victims, people who were tortured at the hands of the Chicago police. But all of those campaigns will be represented on materials, images, and stories. And as many of you know, those were very successful campaigns led by the community. And there are others as well. So that's Wednesday night, the 27th from 5 to 8, and we have just learned that we'll be having a number of spoken word poets performing at the opening, so hopefully you can come back for that. I also wanted to point out that you should be on the lookout for several other end-of-the-year events here at UIC, including a symposium by our graduate students in Museum and Exhibition Studies, and another symposium by art history graduate students, and more, including a very beautiful BFA exhibition upstairs on the 5th floor from our graduating students. But to tonight. Erin Manning is visiting us tonight from Montreal, where she is University Research Chair in Relational Art and Philosophy in the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University. She's also the director of SenseLab, a laboratory that explores the intersections between art practice and philosophy through the matrix of the sensing body and movement. In her art practice, she works between painting, dance, fabric, and sculpture. Current iterations of her artwork explore emergent collectivities through participatory textiles. Her project, Stitching Time, was presented at the 2012 Sydney Biennial, and the Knots of Time opened at the new Flax Museum in Kortrijk, Belgium in 2014. Her writing addresses movement, art, experience, and the political through the prism of process philosophy, with recent works developing a notion of autistic perception and the more than human. She has published books with MIT, Minnesota, and Duke University presses. And tonight she will speak about the minor gesture, as you see up here, which is also the title of her latest book, which is due from Duke in June of this year. As the book's description reads, to embrace the minor gesture's power to fashion relations, its capacity to open new modes of experience and manners of expression, is to challenge the ways in which the neurotypical image of the human devalues alternative ways of being moved by and moving through the world. Can't wait to hear more. Please help me welcome Erin Manning.
Thank you for coming out. It feels loud. Is it really loud? It's okay. I'll put it lower. It's okay. All right. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay. So tonight, I'm going to do something I've actually never done before, which is to speak without notes. So I'm a little worried about that. But it's sort of because I want to give about 3 different talks, and I just couldn't put it all in writing. But what I wanted to say before I begin is that there's this strange thing that happens when you give an artist talk, which is that it makes it look like things have a certain kind of linear progression. And it isn't at all my experience. In fact, as somebody who works across philosophy and art, this bridge between the two has never been very clear to me, and it's never been clear to me how to navigate it. And so most of the time I'm in some anxiety about how to return to the other. And so I created a presentation that is not linear in time, and it's not linear in concept production either. So it's not that I knew these things. I didn't. I have the wisdom of retrospect to be able to make sense of things. And I'll try to speak across different points of time, partly in order to emphasize that for me, philosophy is a different practice in a really fundamental way than art making. And I often worry in the context of people doing academic work around art that we make it necessary for one to encompass the other. And they're asymmetrical, and being a good philosopher doesn't make you a good artist. And so I think that when you're working across the two, there's a necessity for inventing techniques that keep them in trouble with each other. And a lot of this story is about the trouble that's been caused in that relationship over the last 7 or 8 years. So weather patterns or how minor gestures entertain the environment. So a couple of years ago, the other thing I wanted to say is that when I come toward a concept, when a concept develops itself and becomes later on a book, it's almost always through work in the studio. And it's almost always because the work in the studio is not working. So there's or an exhibition is not doing what I thought it could do. And so I hit up against a kind of wall that over time becomes a problem that is productive for me. And the productivity of the problem either leads me to another artwork or it leads me to writing. And so in my next book, The Minor Gesture, I have a chapter on art as way, which came after the Sydney Biennale. And I'm happy in the questions to talk about all of the disasters I lived through in different exhibitions. But this was a moment where I had to think through for myself what I was trying to do with participatory art. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to that particular work. But so for now, what I want to begin with is this idea of art as way. And art as way, if we have any German speakers in the room, the word die Art or the concept die Art, die Art and Weise in German means the manner in which, or the way in which. And as I was trying to think about our tendency to make an object art or to make art an object, I started wondering about why we had given up this medieval definition of art and what would happen if we took it back. What would happen if we began to think about art not as the instantiation and the form it takes, but as the kind of intervention into practice that it makes. And so thinking, for example, that a philosophy might intervene through words, but an artist might intervene through other modes. It could be words as well, but in my case, my art practices don't tend to be language-based, so I tend to work in movement and in different forms of texture. So might there be a way to reclaim the processional that has increasingly become backgrounded in the definition of art as tied to an object, where art as way is not yet about an object, it is still on its way. And this led me to 5 propositions for art as way. And I'll just read them, and they sort of frame the proposition of this whole presentation. And I don't mean to suggest in any way that that the work I'm going to show you sort of lives up to these expectations. This is a speculative proposition that I would like to keep working with. So what is activated by an artwork is not its objecthood. An object in itself is not art. Art is the way, the manner of becoming that is intensified by the coming out of itself of an object. It is the object's outdoing as form or content. 2, intuition, and here I'm thinking intuition in the Bergsonian sense, where intuition is the capacity for a problem to present itself. And for Bergson, a problem is something that doesn't carry already its own solution. Problems that carry their own solutions he calls false problems. Intuition is the work that sets the process of outdoing on its way. The manner of becoming makes time felt in the complexity of its nonlinear duration. Intuition has this capacity for the nonlinear. Happy to talk about this more later. This is an activation of the future, the force of making felt what remains unthinkable, or on the edge of feeling. And here I'm thinking about the idea of thinking, feeling, not feeling as interiority, but feeling as affective tonality. The activation of the manner of becoming is another way of talking about the work's technicity. And this is a term that I've come to as a way to think about both what technique brings to a process and how technique might need to be outdone by the process. So as a dancer, it's not enough to have good technique. Something else has to happen, and this is what I've been trying to think about as technicity, or it's more than. This more than is a dephasing of the work from its initial proposition, and this is going to be really important when I talk about the work. So how can the work carry out its own processual dephasing? Is the work, when it's exhibited, only what was created, or can it do more than that? The relational field activated by the work's outdoing of itself is a more than human ecology of practices. So for me, the question of the more than human has been very, very important. The recognition, of course, that the human is part of the process, or can be part of the process, but not accepting that art has to be reduced to the human, or to human experience, or to human making. Relationally, ecologically, the work participates in a worlding that potentially redefines the limits of existence. And hopefully here you can hear the force of the political. So I'll end today on the question of where I think art and the political might co-compose. So this leads me to the first work that I wanted to talk about. And this is a project that I began around 2004 called Folds to Infinity. And this project began as an exploration of what else clothing can do. It came out of a long practice of my own of designing clothing, and recognizing when I had a boutique that trying on clothing was something very stressful for most people, particularly women. I mostly make clothes for women. Well, not so much anymore, but I did at that time. And the question that started to preoccupy me was the degree to which the shift to prêt-à-porter, which is the typical form of garment that we buy in the stores, created or brought into existence a predisposed body. And this particularly happened in the case of women, because what happened with women is that three measurements began to dictate how we dress: the measurement of breast, waist, and hip. And if you look at the sizing metric, no matter from size 0 to size 24, the relationship between these three measurements always stays the same. So the result of that, of course, is that almost nobody fits into clothing, because unless you have that particular measurement, they won't fit. So, I'm sure you all have this experience: the waist is too big, but the hips, if the hips fit, the waist is too big, or if the legs fit, you can't get them over your calves or whatever. And the thing is that men were not measured in the same way. So men were measured neck, sleeve length, waist, and length of leg. But if you notice, there isn't the same kind of morality inscribed. So if you go to buy jeans and you're a guy, you get to choose, size 32 waist, and then you get like 3 different leg sizes, right? No women's jeans give you, So anyway, there was a problem. I wanted to address this problem by seeing if I could design a collection that allowed the body to create itself in the dressing. And I wanted also to see if I could share with people the experience that I have in making clothing and dressing, that it is how clothing moves that makes the clothing what it can be. So I wanted to also create the conditions for getting rid of the mirror, to get rid of this idea that we have to be represented in a two-dimensional image of ourselves. At the same time, I wanted to question the idea of holding the body to itself in the world. So I was also thinking about how a garment could be architectural. So this led me to the idea of slow clothes, which I'll show images of in a second. And you'll see, and I'll talk about this when I show the image, but when I began to create these installations, which were completely participatory, so people could come in, make themselves garments. In the case of the Sydney Biennale, I was there also to assist in making garments, and I gave the garments away. They could participate in what I conceived as a kind of conceptual proposition of time. It took me 7 years to hand sew the collection, which was 2,000 pieces, had 30,000 buttons, had many magnets and buttonholes, and it was all hand sewn. And I started to really work with the idea that I could bring a certain kind of proposition to the table, but it would only really work if a proposition could emerge from it. So if the work could outdo itself, this became a consideration. And this outdoing of the work I began to think of as a mobile architecture. And just to give you a bit of context, the mobile architecture came to me in looking at dance and thinking about what it is that makes a dance work. Often in the context of thinking choreographically about dance. And it struck me in working with dance that there's something that can happen in the field of a performance where the work begins to shift from its individuals on the stage or its set and become mobile, activate a kind of mobility. And this is what I started thinking about as architecting mobility. And so in the work, and here you see the Sydney Biennale, what I was interested in doing was to see whether I could begin with an initial proposition that was capable or strong enough to create conditions for participation that would never have to be enunciated. So nowhere in any of the iterations of this work was there an account of what you could do. Nowhere did it say that you could make garments, for example. The whole installation of all of these images that I'll show you was magnetic. So pulling a piece meant often taking down half the installation. There was the capacity to rebuild the installation and to make garments. In this particular iteration of the Sydney Biennale, which was very large, the piece was over 3,000 square feet, and it was 3 months. I was there every day for 3 months. There were other propositions. There was tea. There was space to sew. But in general, the idea was that people could come and make garments. And at the Sydney Biennale, because I thought it was the last iteration, there ended up being one more iteration after the Sydney Biennale. I could spend up to a week making a garment with somebody, and I usually approached someone if I noticed they spent a lot of time in the space, and I might ask them if they needed assistance. And then I sent the garment home with them. With them knowing that when they folded it back together, it would lose its shape, right? So it was magnetic, and so it was really a propositional garment. They would have to go back and take the time and fold it again, or it could become something else. And so as you'll see, each iteration had a kind of different sculptural proposition, of course, created in the context of the space in which it took place. And it was this iteration that got me to write the minor gesture. So this was the iteration that I thought didn't work. And I'll show you the other ones afterwards. Sydney Biennale, the Moscow Biennale was the iteration where the curator told me that she thought my work, what was the word she used? I've forgotten it because it troubled me so much. It's sort of synonymous with my work had arrived. And she said, it's really come together. It's it's really clean, and I just felt dead to me. And so I have a lot of thinking to do about why it might be that a work might not be able to do its work from one iteration to another iteration. And that's where I got thinking about the minor gesture, but I'll tell you more about that. And here are some images from the Moscow Biennale. This was one of the first iterations in Montreal, and this was the iteration that allowed me to conceive of the concept of the mobile architecture. And the reason it came, I'm just showing you one of the images, this is a much, much larger piece, is that two things happened in this piece that were really particular, and perhaps they happened in particular in Montreal because it is my community, although a lot of times things that happened didn't happen with people I knew. But in this case, this woman was eventually connected to so many of the pieces from the installation that she was capable with her body of moving the whole thing. And then the third day, the participants took what was really a vertical installation and created a horizontal installation. And that was my first sense that it might be interesting for a work to be able to outdo its initial propositions. And it was from there that then I built this sort of following through with the proposition that I had received from Montreal. But this was an iteration where participation proved absolutely impossible. This one was in Berlin at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt, and I just couldn't get people to participate. I just couldn't. I mean, at one point I actually put a big poster saying, "Please touch," but nothing worked. And but then something really interesting happened in Sydney. I couldn't get them to stop. Honestly, in Sydney, I really wanted to kill them. They participated so much, but so you never know. But in Berlin, something really interesting happened, which is about 2 weeks in, a woman came to me and gave me a piece of the work and told me she'd found it in a bar. And I was both fascinated by the fact that she'd found it in a bar and that she brought it back to me. So the work did do some work, just not with me. And then this was the earliest iteration of the work, which was in Brazil. And in Brazil, it was very, very interesting. I didn't take pictures of that particular aspect of the work, but it was shortly after the Abu Ghraib photograph surfaced. And the participants in Brazil made an enormous grave site with the work. I never photographed. It didn't seem like a thing to photograph. But what was really interesting in Brazil was that at the time I showed in Brazil, I didn't know the Clark's work. And people asked me, "Do you know Lydia Clark?" And I went home and Googled her, and felt very moved that people thought that my work had something to do with her work. But it also made me realize that the Brazilians had a history, and it was very, very clear in them engaging with the work that they had a history of fabric and working with fabric, and they were really very, very creative with the work. So all of that work led me to the concept of the dance of attention. And so I'll go through this concept, and it came from, there was a moment in Sydney where I was just overwhelmed, and it had to do with the Sydney Biennale and the way the art market plays itself out in biennales, which are really not the right place for me, for the kind of thinking that I want to do, because they foreground the neoliberal, art as entertainment model in ways that can get really problematic in relation to participatory art. And in my piece in particular, it was foregrounded as fun, and kids would like it, and it was crazy. I mean, it was sometimes as many as 800 people in a day, and a lot of sort of violent engagement. Not a big percentage, maybe 1%, but somebody tried to burn it down. Somebody tried to cut it up. So you kind of had to watch people. And about 2 months in, I felt really discouraged. I sort of felt like I worked at Gap. I was, I'd made myself this world that was a total nightmare. And people were lining up to get garments that, people would come and say, "I heard you give free garments." So I was really discouraged, and I thought, what have I done? I left the Biennale, and I took buses for a day. And I just wanted to be in a public space and watch the way people interact in a public space and think, why would somebody on a bus care about the bus? Why would somebody coming to an installation care about an installation? Is it a demand I can make as an artist? Or should I let it go? Should I not care? Should it not matter to me if people destroy it? It was during that period that I started to think about the dance of attention and thinking, I needed to get myself out of the way. It didn't happen all at once. It was more difficult than that. But what ended up happening was that I had to leave Sydney to go to Melbourne to set up another installation, and I let it go. I decided I would just let it go and stop babysitting it. And I left the space for 10 days, not knowing if it would still be standing when I came home to Sydney. And when I got home, back to Sydney, people who I'd made garments for had taken care of the space. People I'd never met. And there were these piles of garments that had been started. There were gifts of tea. There were teacups that had been gifted. And that made me realize that I had forgotten about something that later on I began thinking of as artist's way, which is that the work itself has to carry the conditions for its own work. And there was, no matter how much I might have wanted to be the orienter of the work, it had to be able to do that work without me. And so this I started thinking about as the dance of attention. So how else does attention work in a work? How can I get away from the idea of thinking that it is my attentiveness that modulates how a work works? And so I began to think about the milieu itself as attentive. And this is also something that I had learned through, or thought about in the context of dance, that in the context of a choreography, the event dances. You can't attend one-on-one. Movement moves too fast for that. So there has to be another kind of attending in the event. Attention, I thought, has to be its own emergent choreography. We feel attention's dance. It is within the milieu. It is what we connect to when we feel the procedural pull of the event's magnetism. And a dance of attention is not a politics as such, but it does carry the germ of proto-political potential. So coming back to what I was saying before about the more than human, the question for me about the dance of attention had to be within the work's own capacity for working. If the work is about creating the potential, in this case for an emergent collectivity, then it has to attend to its own needs. And if it can't, then I take the responsibility as an artist. I think the artist does have to create those conditions, or at least set them into play. But I don't think you can babysit the work to do that all the way through. And this is, it was returning to the work under these conditions on this particular afternoon that made me realize that one of the ways in which the work really danced to attention in Sydney was through light. And so one of the things that I didn't mention was that you can, in this particular space in Sydney, there were 14 large windows, so the space was completely surrounded with windows. And the work, which is almost all silk, was oriented for the time of day. So I built the work choreographically with the sun. So it began in the blues and it ended in the reds. And my hope was that the light coming into the work would create a certain choreographic orientation for the participant. And this is in light of a concept that was up on the screen a few minutes ago, which is William Forsythe's concept of the choreographic object, which has come to be very important to me. Bill Forsythe thinks of choreographic objects as works that activate qualities of movement. So all art activates qualities of movement, but I think the difference with a choreographic object is that it is particularly attentive to how those choreographic tendencies may orient the conditions of the work. And so in this particular piece, you can't really see them in these images, So there were all kinds of ways in which the work oriented also posture. So there were areas in the work where you could walk standing up. There were areas in the work where you had to walk a little bit more carefully or sideways or lower. But what I did notice coming back after Melbourne was that people spent a lot of time in the work. They tended to spend hours in the work, and they moved with the light. And that participation didn't have to mean touching the work. I knew this intuitively, but I didn't really know it. You know, it takes time, I think, to understand what it is that a work can do. And what I realized was that while I was very interested in how people might want to make garments or how they might want to make architectures, ultimately I was also just as interested in how they might want to take a nap or read a book, and that did end up being one thing, or the things that people did in the space. And so that led me, all of that work, and particularly the work at the Moscow Biennale, led me to thinking about minor gestures. So how did the work activate the potential for a minor gesture? And here the minor gesture, I define it as the gestural force that opens experience to its potential variation. And the minor gesture, the concept of the minor gesture came to me through thinking actually about ritual. I started wondering what it was that contemporary artists were doing when they brought multiples into an exhibition space, as I do, as many of us do. And then didn't put those multiples back in the world. So what ritual tends to do is also work with multiples, but move them back into the world. They carry their magic back. A lot of the time with a slight difference. So the ritual object might be taken care of by a particular person in the community in order to be brought back into the community. But I started wondering what art objects did. A lot of the time, one of the most depressing things about a Biennale is how much work gets destroyed at the end. So many artists don't take it home. And so what is happening is the gesture and the return of the work, I started wondering. Or what would that return look like? And I had the interesting experience of showing my work next to a Chinese artist in both cases, in both Biennales, as Sandong's work. And so both of our pieces were together in both Biennales, and I don't think his work worked in the second Biennale either. So I had this intuition that there was something about the second space that was allowing the work of the multiple. His work was sort of incredible number of articles from his mother's house. Thousands of bags and hair clips and cups and shoes and so on. In the second iteration, in the case of Moscow, we were in a gallery setting, whereas in Sydney we were on an island. So there was also a different architecture, there was a different temporality. To get to Cockatoo Island, you had to get on a boat, you had to walk through an outside space. So there was already a different choreography, a different expectation, perhaps. So anyway, all that led me to try to think about minor gestures. And in the book, I talk about minor gestures also in relation to reconciliation. So I'm thinking a lot about the grand gestures of reconciliation, like our previous government's apology to First Nations people in Canada, which is a very empty gesture, was a very empty gesture in terms of his commitment to First Nations people. And starting to think about the ways in which Indigenous folks in Canada have, through Idle No More and other emergent forms of resistance, produced or foregrounded the minor gestures that are part of those cultures. So minor gestures for me don't in any way have to be allied to artistic processes, but I was interested in how they might appear and what they can do. And in the thinking about the minor gesture, it seemed clear to me that you can't create a minor gesture. So the work has to activate a minor gesture. So you can create conditions for that work. There's perhaps a link between a minor gesture and Duchamp's concept of the infinite. And as with all concepts, it's still exploring itself and trying to come into the world. But it seems important to me that the quality of a minor gesture has a link to the political. That it is capable of articulating perhaps the proto-political force that art touches on when art is interested in attending to shifts in modes of existence. And the last thing about the minor gesture is that it cleaves, it reorients, it's capable, I think, of. I'll give you an example of one artwork. There's a beautiful work by Simran Gill, who's a Malaysian-Australian artist, and she has this work called Pearls. In this work, she invites people to give her a book that's important to them. And then she takes the book and she has a method for ripping it and making pearls out of the whole book. And then she gives you back the pearls as a necklace. But she keeps the cover of the book. And so Simran offered to do this to me, in exchange for a book. And I found myself incapable of giving her the book. And Simran didn't tell me that it needed to be, she didn't say much, except that it seemed to me that it was clear that the gesture included the importance of that book. And for me, the book would be Le Petit Prince. It's a book I've had since I was a child. It has my childhood drawings in it. And I couldn't get rid of it. But the book has been changed by this act of not being able to give it to her. So it carries this minor gesture. It hasn't been transformed, but it has been transformed. It carries the potential of that transformation and is altered by it, I think, for me at least. And this then led to a concept of artfulness. And artfulness came from this moment where, perhaps you know this moment, where you've been working in the studio for a long time and the work comes into itself and it goes into the exhibition and you wonder why you're an artist. And does this mean anything? And what's it worth? And hasn't somebody done this before? And you put all your own money in it. And anyway, I started to wonder what the difference between art and the artful was. We know there's a lot of art out there that is uninteresting. And then there's art that really, really activates something, that's capable of altering the dimensions of experience in minor ways. I don't mean necessarily in ways that are even outstandingly perceptible. But also there are all kinds of ways in which the everyday is transformed by something that isn't made by the human, that has a quality of existence. When I think of artfulness, I often think about the quality of light in the shift of season. I think is very palpable in places probably like Chicago or Montreal where you have a strong shift, a seasonal shift. And so I started to think about artfulness as perhaps being that which happens when a work outdoes itself. So when we don't stick to the idea of the object, but when the object creates a force that propels a process forward, that reorients experience in some way. And I also started to think about the fact that artfulness doesn't belong to the artist. That it has a quality of an aesthetic yield. This is a concept from Raymond Hier. That it has a capacity of emerging where experience isn't settled yet into form. And here, for those of you who might be familiar with my work around autism, this is linked to what I call autistic perception. So autistics speak about how for them the world doesn't categorize, it doesn't chunk as quickly as for neurotypicals. So they talk about how when they enter a room, they don't necessarily see chairs and people and walls, and it can take several minutes for that chunking to appear, which is also neurologically the case for people more on the neurotypical side of the spectrum, but we tend to experience it, or those of us who are more neurotypical tend to experience it only in acute states of drugs or trauma. Well, So artfulness is not something to be beheld. It's something to move through. It's a quality that dances on the edges of perception, where to feel, to see, and to become are indistinguishable. And this all led me to the idea of a weather pattern, and it's through this that I'll show you the next series of work. And let's see. And so a weather pattern can be, these are examples, the movements of the sun on a terrace in the late afternoon, the smell of red in the fall, the weight of closed skies in a dark February winter, the moodiness of shadows on fresh snow, the light after the rain. The project of weather patterns is a project that I don't do alone, so it's a proposition to other artists. I don't make a weather pattern unless another artist wants to make one with me. And then there are some constraints that are part of each weather pattern. One of them is a material constraint, that we operate with a limited set of materials, and that we activate some kind of weather pattern. And so I'll show you a series of these weather patterns. This is the first of the weather patterns with Nathaniel Stern, Andrew Goodman, and Brian Serra, which was interested in using a collection of textiles which had the black textiles that you see there are another collection called volumetrics, which had sensors in them and conductive fabric. And there was a sound, a set of speakers that, analog speakers that created a rhythm of sound, a mobile sound around the environment that was activated by the movement in the space. And our thought for this work was that perhaps it was possible for our work to not take the human as the most entertaining aspect of the environment and to not expect to entertain the human. And I won't stand close to it. And so the environment was had effects on the installation. So shifts of light, shifts of air, shifts of wind altered the algorithm that created the sound. Of course, human shifts were larger and more perceptible. Another one of the weather patterns is called the smell of red, and this piece works with synesthesia, so it's a relationship of spice, mostly cinnamon, but it also has paprika and cocoa. And the space and the interest for me was to see whether there was a relationship. I mean, I never say this anywhere, but for me in the background was whether there was a relationship between color and smell for people. And the environment, which is like an enormous sandbox, is tips in terms of smell. The cocoa side is a little softer and the paprika side is a bit more acute, though you can't, I mean, I don't think you would know that there was a shift. I mean, unless you work with spices and you noticed a slight different color in the cinnamon. And then what made this a choreographic object for me were these tornadoes that were in the space. There were 3 tornadoes. And the tornadoes were at 3 different speeds, and you could only see the funnel if you moved quite slowly in the space. So if people were moving quite quickly, it just looked like there were these 3 strange boxes in the space. But if you began to move more slowly, the funnel would form, and we found that that was actually quite interesting in terms of modulating the movement in the environment. People were also invited to sweep the environment. It was sort of conceived of in relation to a Zen garden. Yeah. And then this is the most recent weather patterns with Andrew Goodman and Samantha Spur, where forces meet. And this one was particularly interested in magnetism. So we created an environment. The materials here were metal shavings, conductive thread, magnets. There were speakers for their magnetic quality, and there were some fans. And so it was a system that was interested in seeing whether over a period of 3 weeks the environment could move slowly from the ground up. And so you see these clumps that was already, I think, the fourth or fifth day. So in the beginning, there was no movement of the metal filings up the conductive thread, but over time, the thread began to sag. So the weight of the thread began to fall toward the ground, and the magnetic filings began to move upwards. And of course, this environment was facilitated by the fans that were part of the system that went on and off in a non-linear way. Mostly because there was only a 3-week period. I mean, ideally the work should have been outside, but how do you do that? So you can see, and there were also piano wires. And you can't really see, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of thread, but the conductive thread is so fine that it doesn't photograph. And the other thing that you can't see, the typical artist telling you what you can't see in the photographs, is that they were on a spectrum. So the threads were on a spectrum of a deep purple to a silver. And so with the light, they did alter the conditions of perception. And so, coming to the end, 2 thoughts on weather patterns. Weather patterns are serial processes. Their beginnings and ends are difficult to ascertain. They are less directional than ecological. Their effects are distributed. None of these qualities make them ideal for the scene of contemporary art, a scene too often constrained by the bounds of what is already recognizable, of what is already imaginable. Weather patterns, like the minor gestures that inform them, invent both modes of thought and modes of perception. In this sense, they are what philosophy call collective assemblages of enunciation. They are field expressions that intensify experience without reducing it to a single point in time or space. They are not metaphors, but metamorphoses, active transducers of the everyday in the everyday. And I'm going to finish with my most recent work, which is, these are just small details because they're not ready, which is perhaps the work most influenced by the minor gesture since it came out of, after the writing of the book. And it's quite a crazy work, and I honestly have days when I'm really not sure it's going to work, and other days where I feel it's going to be okay. I'm showing it in about 6 weeks at the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent. It's a work that is painstakingly slow, so I'm pulling out the threads of 3 fabrics, silk, linen, and cotton. And so the work of the subtraction of the threads is very, 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 very slow. And once the threads are subtracted, I'm sewing them back in. And the work itself emerged from a question about subtraction and neoliberalism. We live in an era where there's such a pressure to do more. And I was interested in how these 3 fabrics, which are very, very plain and normal everyday fabrics, one of them from a flea market, 2 others just found, how these very plain fabrics already carried the work within them, and whether this very, very slow work of pulling the threads might allow them to appear differently. But the question I think that I struggle with most is that while there's no question that things have appeared over this process, I'm not sure that it's enough. Part of the work of an exhibition is to do something that is perceptible. and so what I'm trying to do with this work is refrain for as long as I can by tricking myself or doing that work that we know how to do as artists to make it look like a work. What I've found, which has surprised me, as in the making of this, just the piece of silk, this is about 6 months of pulling, so we're talking really, really, really slow. Not every day, but what has surprised me as somebody who's very uneasy with metaphor is that I have been thinking about the refugees a lot as I've been making this work. I don't draw. Drawing has never been one of my practices, but it's been really clear to me that these works are emerging into a drawing. And that the paths that they've been tracing have been drawing, well, they've been making paths, yeah. And that the paths that they've been tracing are not paths I can control. And what I mean by that is that, as you can see from the three weaves, the paths are very, very particular to the material itself. So the easiest one is the cotton, which is the one in between, because I can pull pieces that are the whole length of its weave. But it creates a grid-like structure, and I can't necessarily create the orientation that I might have liked in the silk, which in and of itself creates a different kind of orientation. And so I've been thinking about this a lot as the work moves into a form. It will become an installation, but it won't be an installation where the participants have where they manipulate the work, which is, you know, there's a lot of work that I haven't shown you, but it's one of my only works in the last 10 or so years where there isn't that manipulation. Also, the one I just showed you from Melbourne, the one just before. So I'm also interested in whether the work can do the work of a kind of durational work without participation in that way. Will people stay? It's a work that is so subtle. I mean, now you're getting real close-ups. You know, you have to imagine these are 6 meters long. You know, you don't see this much when you're looking at them. Will they be able to do something in the context of a museum, or will the museum really just kill it? And these are open questions. I mean, I'll tell you afterwards. So the question I'm asking myself is, will I be successful in creating a technique for a minor gesture? And at this point, the only thing I can tell you is that I've had to be the constraint that I've set for myself has not, for months and months, didn't feel particularly enabling. We talk at the SenseLab a lot about enabling constraints. It was a tough constraint to live with. It was really boring. I mean, and very, very repetitive. And I've done boring, repetitive work for years, but this was like singularly boring and repetitive. But now getting closer to the edge, I feel like I have been able to do something that is definitely not in my temperament. I'm not a patient person. And so by forcing myself to be that patient, something may be emerging that is going to be surprising, at least to me. Who knows about the rest? And so I want to finish with this last slide on the question of the political. I'll just read this. The register of the minor gesture is always political for me. In its punctual reorienting of the event, the minor gesture invents new modes of life living. It moves through the event, creating a pulse, opening the way for new tendencies to emerge. And in the resonances that are awakened, potential for difference moves. This is how I am defining the political. The movement activated in the event by a difference in register that awakens new modes of encounter and creates new forms of life living. Life living refuses to privilege this life, this human life, at the expense of different forms and forces of life, even as it recognizes the importance of the punctuality of this singular event we call our life. Life living is a way of thinking life with and beyond the human, thinking life as ordinary. Thank you.
Well, we end. We are recording tonight's event, so if you have questions, I'll have to give you the mic so it can be recorded.
So for the weather pattern piece, I saw several of them are like you kind of making the machine to let the machine do the work. And the last piece you showed us is like you were talking about this kind of boring singular gesture. And like, you know, the minor gesture, your question, you were trying to point out that I'm just wondering, like, what do you feel about like you making a machine just or like setting up like the structure just for the purpose, or like even this like the earth help you to building this thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I didn't say was that weather patterns developed out of that question. It was a moment in Montreal where a lot of money went into new media. We received a $26 million grant, and a new institute was formed called Hexagram. And suddenly, and I was a painter, and suddenly, like, you know, nobody was painting. Everybody was making new media work. And what I worried about in that context was that machines or systems were being built that you couldn't go backwards on because there was so much of the financial investment in them. And so you had to live with them. And so it was common for people to say, well, I really kind of wanted it to do that, but in the end, this is what it produced. It was also the period where the question of non-human agency became sort of current in the context of new media art. And so I started weather patterns with some students saying, you're not allowed to spend more than $25 at a time. And we did that in order to be able to throw things away, or to throw ideas away, to do the work that was more familiar to me as an artist, where you get rid of so much. And that was sort of happening at the same time. I mean, this wasn't really chronological. I was making weather patterns at the same time as I was making slow clothes. But it was also happening at a time when I realized more and more that the participatory work needed to be it needed to carry a certain imperfection with it. If the work was too pristine, people didn't participate well. So it had to carry a capacity to be invented or to be modulated, for people to feel invited into it. And the systems that were being produced often had this quality, particularly then, of being too fragile. So people who were making wearables, for example, you couldn't throw them on the ground. And so it was in this period that, you know, in my exploration of wearables, that's why I went to magnets, because I realized magnets did all the work I wanted a wearable to do without any of the fear of being destroyed and so on. And so that's where the machinic impulse came in. So I started collaborating with people who had the skills to make a system to work with Max NSP or whatever. And definitely with the last weather pattern that I showed, that was a system, and it was called, I was corrected so many times. Do you remember what it's called? A self-organizing criticality. You should really know what your collaborators call your work. So it was, this was Andrew Goodman who created the system, and it was an attempt to move from a certain kind of machinic relationship to an algorithm to another kind of machinic relationship to an algorithm. So if you're like me and you didn't know what a self-organizing criticality is, we're not going to be able to explain it very well, but what I can tell you is that it isn't random. Every time I said that it was random, Andrew wanted to kill me. And so what it does is it's an algorithm that attunes to itself over time. I'm definitely interested in both, and I'm interested in that's maybe what makes the collaboration so interesting to me, because in that process what I realized is that it doesn't suit my personal disposition to do that kind of work. I'm very materially oriented, and so I don't get excited about that part. But if I'm working with somebody who can get excited about that part and who doesn't worry about me getting excited about threads, then we can work together and address those kinds of questions.
Excuse me. I'm curious about the way you're talking about participatory stuff in your work. It seems like it needs to be a real material sort of actual, if I use that word, interaction. I'm wondering if there's room for it to be a sort of mental interaction.
Absolutely. So the work that I do that I didn't talk about at all is a SenseLab, and where the questions of how else we come together are at the core, and they move all the way from philosophic reading groups to activist work, right? And at the SenseLab, the difference is that we're not invested in creating an object that could be seen as an object. I mean, sometimes we make objects, but they're oriented for example, we've made publications that have definite artistic tendencies. I mean, they look like artworks, but definitely perhaps the place in which I think the most about a non-material or a less material participatory intervention would be through pedagogy. And so what other forms of thinking can be activated? And I don't just mean here in a classroom, but I mean, in an environment, could be a natural environment or a speculative environment. So I think, what in coming to think of art as way, what I've been thinking is that we have different ways of coming to the questions that orient our lives. And my way tends to be very material. I mean, I think of concepts materially. I have a kind of textured way of thinking about them. But I want to be able to collaborate with someone whose way is quite different, right? Whose way might not move through materials. And I don't privilege one over the other. It just happens that the material interventions take me somewhere where the problem can gain a certain consistency. And so far that tendency has proven rich enough to continue it, let's say. Depending on when you ask me. Anybody else?
I love how you were talking about making philosophy and making art and how they're different. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you, because you go in between the two of them, and how you approach making philosophy.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I worry about it is because I supervise so many art-based PhDs, right? So I worry about the relationship between art and philosophy because I see the shortcuts that are forced onto students in relation to the question that I was just answering. There's a lot of uneasiness in me about how I come to a problem. And some years ago, somebody made a kind of stray comment that a good artist was somebody who knew how to create a good problem, and that could take a lifetime. It really stayed with me that we live in a world of false problems, and false problems are quick. They carry their own solutions. They map quite easily onto the worlds in which we live. They do the work of a dissertation. Dissertations are often false problems because how can you create a 4-year project that has a beginning and the end if it doesn't have a solution already inscribed in it? And exhibition is often also a false problem, my own included. Like, I'm not excluding myself from this at all. So there's always a difference in the way I think between what I can do and what I'm interested in speculating about. So I'm not suggesting by any means I've got this worked out, but what I think is that what philosophy does is it attends to language problems. So the problems do work themselves out in language. They have their material as language. And they're interested in the rigor of that particular kind of materiality. So they do it differently, but on a spectrum with poetry, for example. Poetry and philosophy have some relationship, but they don't do the same work materially. And I'm interested in the rigor of that materiality, and I'm interested in the techniques that are at the heart of that rigor. So if I'm working with philosophy, I'm working through close reading. I'm working with the quality of the architecture that is created. I'm not interested in a kind of quick critique. I'm interested in understanding what makes this architecture do its work this way. And in art, I think it's very, very similar, but the same techniques don't work. You can't, if I go into the studio with a philosophic technique, I'm going to make really bad art. So I can't do that, right? And so I have to So, which is why it's unresolved for me. I can't do them both at once. I actually have to end one completely and start another one completely, and it's months of one or the other, and I just don't manage to go back and forth. The only thing I can go back and forth with is dancing. And I think it's because it's just in another realm. And so I think, for me at least, art, like if I, the example of the materials of those three materials, I have to do the work that the materials ask for. And it's its own slow process. And so for me, that requires often an iterative process. So 2,000 pieces of fabric, hand sewn for folds to infinity. I don't think I'll be that crazy again, but there's a sense of getting myself in a different rhythm and allowing that rhythm to unfold. And so that's why when I started, I said, it's going to sound like I knew these concepts could emerge. I really didn't. I'm a slow maker, and the arcs are quite broad, and often, like I said, there's a period of real uncertainty around the moment of exhibition of the work, where I really begin to wonder whether it's capable of doing its work in that context. And I'm very torn about sites of exhibition, the sites of exhibition that I've granted here in museums and so on, and whether they're even capable of doing that kind of work. And I'm as unsure about whether the university is capable of doing the work of philosophy, I should say. So I'm as unsure about one world as the other.
Any last question?
Thank you for this talk. It's really great. So thinking about kind of what you just said, a lot of the way you sort of characterize your own work, just like about setting up conditions for something to happen. And it made me think about Erin Manning's little book on art from a couple of years ago. He, in a sort of offhanded comment, offered one potential, or maybe many definitions of art as like something that recreates a feeling, like the feeling of love, the feeling of arrival, or something like that. But then the last thing you said made me, so at first I was like, oh, well, Erin Manning is coming from a very different place, like thinking about like not recreating some other sort of feeling or spirit or something like that, but creating some context or possibility for something totally new, right? But then this concern about can that happen in this context makes me think you are maybe after like creating something that can recreate or bring in some experience that you had for other people. So I meant this to be a pretty simple question, but I wonder if like, do you see, like, is there any like recreation or like attempt to bring something back in your work, or is it all about sort of forward?
It's a really good question. When I finished the minor gesture, when you finish an academic book, they send it to manuscript reviewers, and I got really engaged reviews. I was very lucky. But one of the reviewers mentioned that he thought the book was optimistic, and I don't feel optimistic. So I wrote an extra chapter called Affirmation Without Credit. And it's a chapter that's very, very influenced by Fred Milton and Stefano Harney's The Undercommons, which is a book that, if you haven't read it yet, you gotta read it. It's an amazing, amazing book, The Undercommons. And the image in the book that stays with me, and Fred and Stefano talk about study. And the image they have of study is the two men sitting in their rocking chairs in front of the house, right? And they say sometimes study happens in the university, but it's rare. And they have a really extraordinary chapter on debt and about the problem of the relationship between debt and credit and the necessity to operate in bad debt. And that, I think, is very close to Nietzsche's concept of affirmation. And so I thought a lot about the difference between optimism and affirmation. And Nietzsche puts affirmation on the side of the tragic, because affirmation is the force that splits, that cuts, that unmoors. And so I think like so many other people who are engaged in whatever way in the world as it is, it's hard, right? It's hard to figure out. I mean, that's one of the things I struggle with art. You know, is it enough? Is this work? I think that's a question I think many of us often ask. Is this enough? But it's really easy to go from the is it enough to the grand gesture, right? And I found myself a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, in a burnout, realizing that I had fallen prey to my own. I mean, I really did everything I said I wasn't going to do, and I made it so that I seemed to believe that the world was on my shoulders, and if I just did more, right? And so I started thinking a lot about how part of the work, perhaps, that I feel we need to do is to reactivate the force of the minor gesture, the deviations that alter the quality of existence, that are often imperceptible, but that challenge the concept of value as it exists. And so it's always a question to me of which, you know, where in all of that do big cuts happen? And one of the cuts that is happening for me is that we're leaving the university to start an unaccredited free university. So the university feels like a dead end to me. But I'm still showing in a museum, right? So I don't need to make it sort of unparadoxical. There's so many paradoxes in all of this. But one of the things that I know I can't live with is the accumulation of debt in relation to students. And I think that, I think we need the university. I'm not saying we don't need the university. I think we really need it. We need those infrastructures. We need what it can offer. But we also, those of us who can, those of us who have paid off our mortgages and have had good salaries, we can actually do the work of creating something else. And we can perhaps stop asking young people who are so precarious to do that work. And we can do it together with other forces. And in the midst of that, it still feels relevant for me to make art. But I can't say, you know, yeah, it's just the hardest question in the world, right? I can't really say. I would separate myself from Badiou in the sense that Deleuze's event or Whitehead's event is very different from Badiou's event. And I don't think there's much space for the minor gesture in Badiou's event, because the Badiou's event requires it's a rare thing, and it requires a full transformation, whereas the Whiteheadian event or the Deleuzean event is the world, right? And it is there that the minor operates more, I guess. You know, I'm not a specialist.
Well, if there are no more questions,